Thanks, Jess. Thanks, Joy.
Great idea. I appreciate that very much. Okay, so what did we glean? What did we glean along the way? Well, let me tell you a little bit about this first phase of research. We invited all the hubs to participate, and 12 agreed to be part of the project. And in those hubs, we conducted 23 focus groups and 5 interviews. These focus groups were built around a technique that Kathleen mentioned earlier, one that I use quite frequently, called Photovoice. Photovoice is a way of inviting people into a focus group that uses photography. We gave them a set of questions, and I'll talk about those in a minute. We gave them a set of questions and asked them to take pictures about their experiences. We wanted to know where they were flourishing, where they were struggling, and where they were innovating. And we asked them to use those photos then during the focus group to tell stories. And what this helps to do is photographs really are designed as storytelling tools, and it prompts our participants to tell stories as opposed to just sort of rattle off statistics and facts. And it brings you into the life world and into the narratives. And you'll see this in a few minutes as Nancy and I start sharing some of these. These focus groups brought together, connected in some way within each hub. So in each hub, we invited the hub directors to provide us with lists of potential participants. And in each hub, we did a focus group comprising leaders and another focus group comprising participants. Each of these focus groups had anywhere from 3 to 6 people involved. And those 3 to 6 people cut across many different congregations. One of the wonderful things about a focus group, and in particular Photovoice, is that not only is the facilitator the one that's leading and prompting and asking questions, it's also the other participants. So this was another opportunity for folks to learn from each other. I know there have been a lot of occasions within hubs to have meetings that brought together various leaders, and there was a bit of cross-pollination there. We also saw that happening a little bit throughout the process of research. And it was very affirming for a lot of people as they talked about this opportunity to gather together and share what was happening. Well, those conversations with around 66 participants led to hundreds of stories, and we would like to tell some of those stories. But first, let me tell you what questions we provided them to get to those stories. We asked them, we used this biblical metaphor of the field, and we wanted to know about the wheat, right? In what ways are people flourishing as a result of participating in a calling program in their congregation? What is the wheat of the program's harvest? Secondly, we asked them to take a series of photos. Again, it was just a handful of photographs, 3 to 5, but we also wanted to see what the weeds were, right? What did they experience as a participant that made it difficult to grow? What were the weeds of difficulty or disappointed that needed to be pulled from the program? Now, this could refer to a program on the congregational level, or it could refer to something happening on the hub level. And we heard stories across both. And finally, we asked people about the seeds. What opportunities for growth did they see in the program? What seeds of insight or innovation would they plant to improve the harvest? Before we move on to some stories, I wanted to see, Kathleen, if there was any follow-up on your end.
No, I don't see any questions. Anybody have anything? You can feel free to put it in the chat or just raise your hand. I think we're good.
Okay. Yeah, and thanks. I should have said that at the beginning, that we are certainly open to your questions along the way. There may be a detail that we move past too quickly. There may be something that you want to, invite a little bit more detail from us. So feel free. The chat's a great place to do that. Or with so many people on a call, it's hard to keep track of hands being raised. So I think the chat is probably our best bet for making sure we don't miss your question. And I know that Jesse and Kathleen are monitoring that for us. Okay, so let's think about some of these wheat stories. Nancy and I are going to kind of back and forth here, and we're going to work our way through a series of these stories just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that people were saying to us. We heard quite a few people talking about the successes of programs, particularly around things like bringing awareness in terms of personal spirituality and growth. Now, the photos that we're going to be sharing here are actual photos that people shared with us. I think this might have been a screenshot, and we're open to that kind of thing. But many of the photographs are people's, cell phone photos, so they're not always the highest quality, but they do let you have a sense of how they're using these images to tell stories. And so a reminder here that our focus on this program evaluation really is at the congregational level, but we don't want to gloss over the fact that there's so much happening well below the surface of that at the individual level. And we certainly are paying attention to it. We don't have quite enough data collected yet in order to get down to those fine details. So personal spiritual growth was we call it a theme that came up over and over again.
One of the other things that we heard a lot about was that congregations were beginning to engage in their neighborhoods in ways that perhaps they hadn't before. Is there a problem?
No, go ahead. Sorry, someone just wasn't on mute.
Oh, okay. One of the things that I've really enjoyed, since I wasn't actually able to be a part of the focus groups themselves, was reading the transcripts and hearing the stories vicariously from people as they were telling them, and seeing these wonderful pictures that they provided as a way of expressing some of the stories that they were involved in. And, a lot of them talked about learning to venture out into their neighborhoods in new ways and learning to listen to the people in the neighborhoods and really trying to think hard about how they could be better citizens in their neighborhoods, how they could minister in more effective ways to their neighborhoods.
We also heard a lot of stories about these intergenerational concerns, something that congregations seem to be constantly wrestling with, is how to bridge that divide. This leader is saying that they're learning and trying to teach and show their young people through their history, through an intergenerational connection. And a lot of times it was opportunities that they were creating for these kinds of relationships to grow and to prosper. Sometimes they were in small groups. Sometimes they were adults sort of infiltrating, if you will, into the everyday lives of these young people. But again, there's a definitely concern. We're seeing this across the hubs, an interest in building these generational connections that will lead not only to vibrant congregations, but also, again, back to that question of what's happening on the ground with individuals, so that individuals are having a full experience in the notion of a calling, finding meaning and purpose.
One of the things that happened when congregational leaders started talking about calling is that it precipitated conversations about exactly who it is that's called and how we think differently, perhaps, about the way we structure our congregational leadership. There were a number of leaders who basically said to us, I just didn't recognize the degree to which it would make a difference to have people in the congregation starting to pay attention to themselves as called. And one of the things that's interesting here is that sometimes their lay people knew this all along. I love this quote from this layperson who said, you know, you, Pastor, you just don't ask the people that you don't think are going to want to volunteer. And she says, this is an inside joke that I was right and he was wrong. So there were these conversations about exactly who should be leading. And in some cases that really did come out of and lead to pastors themselves thinking about what calling was about, and the larger congregation and the individuals in the congregation beginning to think about themselves as a called congregation. This pastor says, I remind them that it's not me, it's us.
One of my absolute favorite parts of this research was a particular conversation that I had. It was great. I had the chance to do about half of the focus groups to facilitate them. And so learned a ton along the way, but this really stands out to me as one of the really fun conversations. In one of the churches, they used a lot of artifacts, a lot of visible reminders, and I'll show you a picture of more in a second. One of these visual reminders was a pin. You can see it pictured there in the bottom left of the screen. It says peace, and then within peace, it says hope, joy, love. And participants in this project were given these pins to wear around. And so this one participant was telling the story of the pin and how putting it on made them sort of, I don't know, straighten up, much as you put on your nice clothes and it makes you into a different person. And so wearing this pin around, very cognizant of, oh my goodness, I have this pin. I better be on my best behavior. I better not be, a little antsy or rude or whatever in the checkout line. And talked about, encountering other people in their town and them saying, wow, what's that? What's going on? And the conversations that led to that. This person even says that she would carry extra pins to hand out. Well, her story goes on. And at one point she tells this just fascinating moment where she bumps into somebody and they say, oh, do you work at the post office? No. Why would you say that? Well, because of the pins. Apparently, all the people in the post office ended up with these pins. And so there was a little bit, not a terrible confusion, but they became so prolific that they're all over in everyday life. And I think that's a really interesting metaphor, right, for the idea of a calling and how so many congregations are trying to really make this part of the fabric of their organizational culture. And this particular congregation is using not just peace pins, they were having these Jesus calling moments in their bulletins each week where, how is Jesus calling you to be the church today? What is Jesus calling you to do? How is he inviting you to change? Large reminder of amen right in the middle of their, walking in and out of the sanctuary. Again, another visible reminder. This is something. This is punctuating who they are. Down in the bottom right there, a journal. And what they, on the top left, you see the peace pin, P-I-N. On the bottom right, you see the peace pen, P-E-N. And so it was just, I don't like the word necessarily of branding, but it felt like that level of intention and thoughtfulness of really trying to bring in these details, helping it to really wrap around to become part of the fabric of life, or the water that this school of fish, so to speak, swim in.
A lot of our congregations that we heard stories from had really undertaken very deep and important self-introspection, especially around issues of racial justice. One of our congregations talked a lot about the really amazing way in which they're attempting to change how they are engaged in their communities and in terms of racial justice. But along the way, what that meant was that they had to confront the places in their congregational life where they were broken. And they very inventively supplied this picture of a bunch of broken chairs that had accumulated in a corner of the church, and said, you know, these are chairs that are an example of things that piled up and got broken, that for years needed to be fixed. Some couldn't be fixed. So people were confronting what could have been weeds, and in some cases, weeds that simply had to stay, but others where they were able to get past that brokenness and move into fruitful, wheat-like flourishing in their congregational life together.
We heard a little bit about weeds as well. In these focus groups, they were scheduled to be about 2 hours in length. And typically, the way that time ended up being used is folks talked for about an hour collectively about the wheat. And then the weeds tended to be somewhere around a half an hour. And so did the seeds, ended up being about a half an hour. Part of that might have been time management on our end. You know, it's just exciting to talk about the weed or the wheat rather, and a little bit uncomfortable to talk about those difficult things. But anyways, we heard enough to begin thinking about what's happening, what made things difficult. And I think this first weed is going to come as no surprise to any of you. But what it did is it created an awful lot of empathy for the research team. We really began to see through the lens of particularly leaders and lay people as they struggled through the pandemic. So I'm going to share a couple of slides here from the same leader. And the quote that just strikes me is there at the top as the title: survival kind of became the calling. Survival kind of became the calling. And he talked about hanging this picture on the door of their sanctuary, that all in-person activities have been suspended until further notice. We all remember that moment, and it might have been, the timing might have been a little bit different for each of us when those doors were closed to something big. And reflecting on, well, what do we do next? And I think in that, this leader had a really keen insight into calling and how they can change in an instant, right? Circumstances might change. We're still called to something, but it might cause us to reframe or to pivot. There's that word, pivot. Can't seem to escape it. Then the pastor went on to talk about how their pulpit became this electronic stack of gadgets, and preaching then to an empty set of pews, like many of us have seen and many of you have done. But in here, and it's not included in this quote, but behind the scenes is that this person's in a rural community, in a place where bandwidth is at a premium and where people aren't accustomed to using technology in the ways that it became necessary in order to become part of congregational life. So here, you know, this pivot, I think what's interesting here is that this idea of the pivot and losing ground on calling and what had been planned, that comes through here in this quote. You know, realize that there's still work to do, right? And it's almost as though, in this case, the pandemic was a sort of a litmus test for how things were going, right? I'm going to have to back away from these efforts to permeate our culture with the idea of a calling. Now I'm forced to step back That's an interesting point in time to begin thinking about, well, how well did things go? How much did people actually grab a hold of what we're trying to do? Yes, I think this one's mine as well, right?
Mhm.
Okay. We've been going back and forth, and there's this weird point where, oh, I go twice. So not only were these difficulties that people had because of the pandemic happening on the congregational level, I'm sure you felt and saw this at the hub level too. And here's someone reflecting on, they use this photograph of a couple of snails. It might be hard to see, but these snails are going in opposite directions, right? And they use this picture to talk about hub level meetings with leaders, whether they're a layperson or not, but this is at that hub level. And feeling like, well, things are changing so much. It doesn't feel like it's the same people on that meeting all the time. It's hard to connect. It's hard to engage. That's slowing things down. Just again, a difficulty that was experienced. And like on the congregational level, also at the hub level, I'm not sure that there was much that could have been done about these circumstances, but we need to spend a little bit of time reflecting on them and what they reveal to us.
One of the things that partly came out of the pandemic, but also was, I think, more deeply structural than just about the pandemic, was the struggle that many of the people talked about to sort of spread the goods beyond their leadership team. You might say that this was a kind of common species of weed that we encountered as we were listening to what they were talking to us about. That there were people who were on their leadership team who had become really fully invested and engaged in the initiative, but they hadn't necessarily been able to get others in the congregation fully engaged. And here, this person talks about the difficulty of just that their leadership team has the intimate knowledge of what should be done and how to do it and so forth. And they've talked to the congregation, but they don't necessarily feel like they have gotten full buy-in from the larger congregation. And for a number of the people that we talked to, that really was experienced as a weed, as something that made it difficult for them to really move forward with what they were trying to do.
There were weeds, but there were also people that were very reflective and saw the silver linings in things from time to time. So this leader took a picture of the potted mint by their back door and talked about how it had gotten leggy and it needed trimmed, and that actually brought, further growth. And in some ways, that's the way the pandemic kind of was for some people, or at least some aspect of their life and work. And it's just a reminder to us that, yeah, there was a lot going on. There's still a lot going on, many difficulties and challenges ahead, I'm sure. And as we reflect on this, we also want to look within these weeds to see what might have been helpful, a kind of a pruning of sorts.
So what we heard was that in spite of the weeds, in spite of the challenges, there is hope, just like we celebrate at Easter. This church lamented that there were so few people at this sunrise Easter service that they shared the photo of. But they still wondered, are there seeds that have been planted in this program that are going to indeed produce fruit in the future?
Now to some of the hope, opportunities for growth, places where we saw people innovating a little bit. So a particular congregation, a particular project developed this project around bringing an Arabic-speaking congregation together with a Caucasian English-speaking congregation. And it was this really beautiful effort in bridging those cultural divides within the same denomination, same tradition. And this person describes then how this happened. You know, we'd prepare a meal together. Maybe one congregation would prepare it. Maybe we'd make it together. We'd eat, we'd pray, we'd have a Bible study. And they talked about that part of this slide, this part of this quotation, early on during the wheat. This is what's exciting. This is where we're growing and flourishing. And now, at the last part of the focus group, thinking about the potential, the seeds, they talked about how they were taking that manual that was in English, having it translated into Arabic. I'm not sure about this person's statistic at the end of the quote, but the area that they live in is one of the largest Arabic-speaking parts of the United States, and then wanting to be able to use this resource further afield, not only with their own congregations and experience, but also with university students, and maybe even across religious divides as well. So bringing together Muslims and Christians potentially into dialogue.
We heard a number of stories about the way one thing leads to another. That congregation we heard from earlier that was really concerned about some intergenerational initiatives had started a community garden. And as they started the community garden, that ended up leading to making more connections with other partners in the community, getting additional funding, and learning about the environment, all of which was a process of really helping them understand how resilient they actually were in being able to move from difficulty to flourishing to seeds for new opportunities in the future.
Another one of these wonderful stories started out early in the pandemic with a couple of people saying, okay, we can't really do any of the stuff we had set out to do. What shall we do? I need to go for a walk, essentially. And they started to exercise together. They started to walk around their community. They started to gather together, and the word got out. Social media took over. Hey, we're meeting on this particular night and we're walking through these neighborhoods. Now, this is a community of color that is out walking through, and they're walking through different parts of their city, sort of through the various cross sections as a way not only to exercise, but also, I think, to be present in those neighborhoods as the summer of George Floyd, of questioning where we are as a country in terms of the progress that we've made and haven't made around race and justice. And this person then snaps this picture, and says, look what we've grown into. We're something now. I mean, it's amazing things that they did. They invited like a shoe retailer in, and they got everybody discounts for sneakers. I mean, they were really doing some creative stuff. And, reflecting on their experience and wondering, okay, how do we invite others into this? How do we bring other people along? And I think that I hadn't entirely figured it out yet, but it's that intention. And we see a lot of intentions coming up and coming out of this process.
One of the most consistent things that we heard, and it's not so much that it helps to have fiends, but friends.
Oh, goodness. That might be my favorite typo in recent history.
Yes.
Sorry, friends.
No, one of the things that people learned was just how important it was to them to have an opportunity to share the burdens with each other. The peer learning that took place and the support that took place in those cohort groups turned out to be one of the most important and fruitful things that I think a lot of people said to us, you know, this is a seed for the future. This is something we don't want to let go of. We want to continue to have the opportunity to be together, for that to breathe life into us, to discover that we're not alone in doing God's work and serving God's people.
That wraps up the stories that we feel like we have time to tell. How is this? How are you experiencing this, Kathleen? I know that we're right about it where we thought we'd be in terms of schedule. We want to take a little pause here. I'm not sure if there's some questions at this point, or maybe you have something on your mind.
I think you've been great friends here to us and really put out a feast for us to consider. So let's just move to the Padlet. Let's just take a little break. We've been on for about 45 minutes or so, unless somebody has a quick question in the chat, but I don't see one. So Jesse has listed a link in the chat, and we've used Padlet before, so any of you are new to it, just click on that. It'll open in another browser window, and we've put 3 questions up there for you. How do what Nancy and Roman just shared about these wheat, weeds, and seeds from these stories compare to your experiences with congregations? You just click on that plus sign and write your comment. What strikes you as particularly interesting? And what do you have to add based on what you know about your congregations? So to flesh out some of the gleanings they've offered here. So this Padlet's going to be up for the next 15 minutes. So you can take a break, turn off your camera if you want, walk away, get a refreshment, write your thoughts down. We'll reconvene at I better look at my schedule here. We're going to reconvene at 11, right? 15 minutes.
Yep.
15 minutes. Okay, sound good? Everybody got the instructions? Go ahead and type away. You'll see other people's comments up there as they go. And we'll see you at 11. Well, there's a lot of really interesting comments in the Padlet. Let's just take a minute to. Okay, I'm not going to offer a comprehensive analysis of this, but maybe Nancy and Roman have one or two that they'd like to respond to. A lot about your comments about rethinking congregational leadership, a lot on the visual reminders, attending to what is broken. People had a lot to say about that.
Yeah, first of all, we'd just love to say thank you for engaging this material at this level. You've given us some things to think about here. It's insightful to hear your reflections. So just want to say a big thanks. Really appreciate you engaging.
Is there maybe one or two you want to lift up and comment on, Roman? Or
well, I mean, you pointed out the one, of course, that I think I'm very fascinated with is the ways that artifacts, reminders, I'm not sure if it's the right term yet, but Nancy and I shared with her this idea of layering, right? We're layering down bits of culture and they're stacking in on top of us. And it's kind of, I've talked about this in some of my writing as behavioral residue. You leave this path behind you, right, of the behaviors that you have, and it makes a mark not only in the world that you live in, but also it makes a mark on you. And that little simple reminder of a pin. People do this oftentimes with other things like tattoos, right? And so when you see someone with that tattoo, one of the first questions you want to ask yourself is, who is that message pointed toward? Right. And so the classic example is the person, I think a lot of Texans have tattoos of the shape of Texas on them somewhere, and if that's on their forearm and you look down as the person who has the tattoo and it looks like it would be on the map from your perspective, that's really a self-directed idea. Right. And so thinking through questions around the artifacts that people are using, are they using these artifacts to point back to themselves or what they should do? Are they putting on the pin to help sort of self-regulate out in public, to be a certain kind of person? Now, other times that Texas tattoo might be up on the shoulder, so to speak, and pointed out toward other people. Hey, I want you to know that I'm from Texas and I'm proud of it. And that's a wonderful thing. And hey, I hope you're from Texas too. Let's talk. Oh, look, I'm from Texas, roll up my sleeve. Right. And so there's a different kind of communication happening there, and that's others directed. And so I think the same thing can probably be happening with calling. I'm just sort of thinking out loud. I get myself in trouble. So Nancy, jump in if I go too far with this. But I think the same thing might be happening with the way calling can operate in everyday life, is it really can be directed toward the self, and it's also directed toward others. And just the simple reminder, we need to be paying attention to the ways that that's happening, not only on the individual level as the person wearing the pin, but also on the level of the congregation. How's that operating there? And then also in the community, because you saw in that example, this spilled out in unexpected ways. This is something that social scientists are just mad about. We're fascinated by these unintended consequences, right? Who knew? Everybody, all the people working in the post office, now they have these pins. That's amazing. That's really, really amazing. And the kinds of conversations that it leads to.
I will just say a word that one of the things I was looking for and really appreciated in the Padlet comments is the questions that still remain. And that's really where we're going with phase 2. What are the questions that either we didn't touch on at all in the kinds of things we heard in the focus groups, or the ways that we can drill down and get at some answers. One of the things that really did strike me in the Padlet conversations was the observation that the people we talked with in this first phase, for the most part, didn't talk about their own sense of trauma and disjuncture from the kinds of ethnic tensions that have been present, ethnic and racial tensions that have been present in our larger culture. And that's certainly something that we'll be keeping an eye out on in the remaining part of the project.
Yeah. I think one of the things that struck me as I scrolled through, it's hard to get through everything and really think about it. But one of the things that really seemed interesting to me is the shared sense of the messiness of it all, right? And I appreciate seeing that from leaders like you, and there seems to be, at least there's something palpable there about a willingness to embrace that fact. And I think that that's an important posture for moving forward.
Great, thanks for those comments. I know several of us will take away behavioral residue as now a new sociological category. Don't you love the way sociologists speak about these things? I think an interesting comparison there, Roman, might be like hubs that had hubs or congregations that were really intentional about creating visual, particularly art, like I think of some of BU's congregations or Vibrant Faiths, really strong in this way, and several of others have as well. Whether you were really intentional about this or it kind of bubbled up in this way, it's just a kind of a way humans express themselves, and maybe even had to express themselves during COVID, given that we're on camera so much or something. So it's kind of just an interesting question about that.
Absolutely. Lots of interesting questions to continue to ask.
Yeah, this question about clergy and laity is in ABC's proposal when they submitted, and Vibrant and VTS also, I know. Lisa, you've been still asking this question a long time, like, what are we learning about this? What's happened? I suppose the biggest challenge for us is how much would these have been our findings without the pandemic, and how much has the pandemic really shaped this? And it's just really hard to answer that, isn't it? So, well, okay, we will, of course, keep these comments from Padlet if any of you would like them. But I think let's turn now to the second part of our morning program. And here we want to talk about the next steps and how this is setting the researchers up for phase 2. So Roman, how does the phase 1 research now inform what you want to do in phase 2? Like, what strategies are you going to use and look at with the congregations?
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, so after doing these focus groups, the process involved the focus groups being recorded. And from there, those recordings being turned into transcripts. As Nancy said, she's read quite a few of them, all of them, in fact. And we use those transcripts then to do a bit of analysis to identify areas where themes were overlapping. And came up with research designed to move forward and to look more deeply into 10 of the broad themes that we're calling intervention strategies. So, the language that we're using here sounds a little bit technical, and I suppose it is. We're talking about interventions, right? These are deliberate efforts to innovate and to affect change in congregations and individuals around this idea of meaning, calling, and purpose, right? And so these are very intentional activities that people are doing. The ones that we're focusing on fall into 10 large categories. And I'll talk about what those 10 look like and what they are in a minute. But what we've done is we've identified those, and we've chosen 50 congregations that cut across these different intervention strategies, and they're in different hubs, and they're in different locations around the country, and US and Canada. And we're focusing in on 78 cases, right? And so any one strategy can be occurring. And again, it'll be easier to understand what I'm talking about in a minute when I show you a map of how this all plays out. But in those 50 congregations, some congregations were looking at one strategy. So maybe it's, for example, one of the strategies, well, we mentioned it earlier, it came up on Tablet, social justice, right? There are a number of congregations that are focused in on social justice activities. And there might be some up in the Northwest, and the Midwest, and the Northeast. And so we're focusing in on those. And the way we're doing this is Nancy and I mean, as fantastic as it would be for us to be able to be out there in the field and do all this research, we just can't in terms of time and place, and certainly the pandemic wouldn't necessarily allow for it in every case. So we've hired 12 research associates. I think we might be hiring one, maybe two more to cover a couple more gaps. But these are people that we're working with. They range from people that were these sort of superstar undergraduates that are coming out of college, thinking about going on to grad school. There are a few people that are in grad school. There are a couple people who have finished. There are a couple people on the call today. So that's exciting. Glad that they're here as well. So what those research associates will be doing in each congregation, they'll do one key informant interview. And this will be with the person that makes the most sense based on the intervention that they're looking at. Typically, this will be the congregational leader, but maybe not always. It might be another person on staff, or could even be a lay person that was charged with taking the lead in their congregation on their project. Then the research associate will also do a general observation. They'll go to worship typically, and if it's possible to do that in person, and observe, take it in. And part of that process then involves them taking notes, and they'll write up what we call field notes. And these are a very detailed account of what that person experiences and observes during that general observation. And then I'll also do a focus group in each congregation, and I'll bring together the people that are involved in that particular intervention, that strategy for calling that they're pursuing or have pursued, and listen together to them. So that's what happens in each congregation. Then layered on top of that, for each intervention, so some congregations will have more than one. There are 28 congregations that have more than one intervention, so they'll each have two. They'll do two observations of that intervention. It's getting more complicated than I wanted it to sound. What they'll do, so let's say there's the congregation is doing something around adult ed and around preaching. They'll do observations of each of those. They'll interview 3 to 5 participants for each of those interventions. At the end of the day, what they end up with is somewhere around 450 interviews collectively, around 300 focus group participants, and around 300 sets of field notes. So all that to say, we're going to have a mountain of data from several different points of observations and interviews. Anything to add there, Nancy?
That's a good start.
Okay.
Show them your map.
Okay, yeah, that's probably the easiest thing for us to understand. So let's think about how this is playing out. Here's a map of the United States and a little bit of Canada, enough of Canada for us to include our friends up in Vancouver. So let's take this, one of the interventions. So I'm going to show you the 10 interventions that we're taking a closer look at, and to give you a sense of where they're showing up. The dots are big and they're not precise. They're just meaning to indicate that that's the general area of the hub that they're associated with. So social justice, you can see that theme of social justice, that intervention happened in multiple locations, and we're looking at it in those places. We also saw congregations using the internet and media, and we wanted to take a closer look at that, particularly given the times that we're in. Now, when we say internet and media, we don't mean just like Zoom calls. These are people that are really being thoughtful and careful around things like, well, podcasting, for example. What does that look like? How does that play out? What effect has it had on calling? Preaching and worship is something that congregations do a lot of, but specific programs that were targeted at bringing calling into the messages, into the singing, into the overall structure of a worship service. Some congregations were looking at internal and staff changes, and we want to pay attention to that. Other congregations touched on youth and families, and you certainly heard that coming through in the stories that we were telling earlier. Another intervention strategy has to do with individual spiritual practices and trying to structure those into people's daily lives and giving them a set of tools to accomplish that. Some projects really focused in on congregational discernment around the questions of mission and congregational level calling. Others focused on small groups, in particular groups, not just that they were small, but they also involved an awful lot of sharing, of mutual sharing, of conversation, of engaging each other in that way. Adult education played an important role in many congregations. Well, oh my goodness, I'm sorry. I pushed the wrong button. Neighborhood engagement is that final one. That idea that congregations, you know, I go back to that picture Nancy showed earlier of the little hamster gerbil just sort of coming out of its little shell. There's so many congregations that talk about the power of this, of stepping out into their neighborhood and doing things. I talked about it a little bit when I mentioned that walk that the congregation was doing through their different parts of their community. So these are the 10 intervention strategies that were identified through our research process of the focus groups using the photographs, photo voice conversations. And yeah.
Wow, thanks, Roman. See, theologians, we don't have cool things like this. We don't have color maps, you know? That is really a helpful way to kind of picture both the 10 themes and the places that you're going to work. So Nancy, I think you were going to make a brief methodological aside.
Yes. And one of the important things about what you see in that map is that we're not comparing hubs, we're comparing kinds of interventions as they took place in lots of different places. So we got the potential built in here for some really important strategic comparisons. We can begin to ask, by looking at multiple congregations who did similar things, why did it work well here and not so well there? Was it the fact that this is a big congregation and that's a little one? Is it a matter of this is an evangelical congregation and this is a Catholic congregation? Was it a matter of something else about the way in which they went about undertaking this initiative? And those are the kinds of questions that we're going to be trying to address. This is my little methodological aside here. I'm a hopeless comparativist and sociologist, so I had to make some graphs, right? I was interested to see how the congregations in the initiative and the congregations, our 50 that we selected out for our sample, how they compared to each other and how they compared to what we know from the Duke National Congregation Study about the overall shape of congregational life in the US. And what you see here in terms of size is that our sample congregations skew a little bit large or skew away from the small end, but I actually have a hunch that once we get into the congregations and start looking around and not just taking the word of whoever reported what their size was, that we may discover that we actually have more small congregations than we think we do on the front end. We also wanted to look at denominational tradition, sort of the range of kinds of congregations, evangelical Protestants, Black Protestants, Catholic, mainline Protestants. How does this compare? And you'll see that those we're looking at in our sample reflect the initiative pretty closely, but they're different from the overall national picture. Nationally, there are more evangelical congregations and fewer mainline ones than there are in the initiative. And I'm actually not particularly surprised by that. But again, there are enough within these broad families of religious tradition for us to be able to make some comparisons. And finally, looking at the ethnicity of the congregations, like congregations across the country, the number of congregations that are predominantly Asian or Hispanic or other ethnic categories is actually pretty small. We've got a few in the sample. We do have a pretty significant number of African-American congregations and at least a few Hispanic and Asian congregations in the sample. So we have at least a bit of a window on those kinds of differences. But more importantly, let's think about the big questions here. What are we really trying to get at? By looking at those interventions, we're going to be
Nancy, before you get started here, can we just answer a couple questions in the chat?
Sure.
Based on what you had just said? Okay, before you jump ahead.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about what do you mean by intervention? I think people are not familiar with that language. I think it's kind of within your discipline. What do you mean by it? Or do you have a reference to it? And another question. Okay, go ahead and answer that now.
Well, an intervention is simply something that somebody does to try to change something.
Okay.
So if you go to the doctor and you've got high blood pressure, they try to intervene by giving you a drug.
Okay.
Okay. So in this case, the initiative and the people who have been involved in the leadership of the initiative have devised interventions, ways of trying to change things. And those interventions have fallen, as we're hearing things, within these broad categories of kinds of things that people have tried to change.
Okay, so you had a sermon series, or you had a retreat, or you had a small group discussion. You mean
I see Claire asking, would practice be the same? And a practice can be an intervention, but there are lots of practices that aren't interventions.
Okay,
if that makes sense.
And Claire asked another question about, are you making a distinction between interventions that have happened or ones that are planned?
We are only looking at congregations that are well into their work. So people who have actually implemented some sort of intervention in their congregation. So we know that there are whole bunches of people who have been involved in the initiative who haven't gotten that far.
Right. So for those of you hubs that are starting a second or a third cohort, your congregations would not be doing this at that point. In other words, they haven't, made an intervention and then have people to reflect on it. So, okay, I'll watch for any more questions.
Okay,
but
good. Thank you.
Nancy, go right ahead.
Yeah. So we're asking about each of these interventions. How did they do it? What difference did it make? And what factors help to account for those differences in how things went? A pretty standard kind of social science-y kind of questions. What did they do and what difference did it make? As we're doing that, one of the things that has emerged for me as I've thought about this project is how, in some ways, it builds out of work that I did 25 years ago that resulted in the book Congregation and Community. The title of that research project, generously funded by the Lilly Endowment, I might add, was Congregations in Changing Communities Project. And the question there was, these are external changes, interventions, if you will, that were happening whether the congregations liked it or not. These were things that were happening external to the congregation. And the question was, how did the congregations respond to those demographic changes, to growth in the community, decline in the community, changing ethnicity, how the growth of gay and lesbian neighborhoods, and so forth. And now what we're looking at is a kind of external intervention. The endowment comes along, the initiative comes along and says, we want to offer you an opportunity to pursue some change. And it's chosen, it's intentional in this case. So a different way of thinking about this relationship between something that comes along and happens to a congregation and something that is chosen by a congregation. but there's some interesting things that are the same and different between then and now. If you could give me my next slide, Roman, thank you. One of the things that we discovered when we looked at those congregations in the 23 communities around the country was that adaptive change in the congregations was actually very rare. Most of the change that happened in these communities happened because old congregations died and new ones were born, rather than the existing congregations really adapting. So the question is, if you have a different kind of change that happens externally, a different kind of intervention, what's going to happen now? How do we understand that? So those are the questions that we're trying to pursue. How do congregations change? And I'm returning in structuring this to some of the same kinds of questions and findings that we had in that earlier study. In some ways, that really informs how we're trying to think about this. One of the key things that we discovered made a difference was resources. Now, by resources, we don't just mean how big their budget is. We mean a broad range of things that allows people to do what they feel called to do. So we're going to be paying attention in these congregations to differences, to ways in which they are able to mobilize people in the congregation, that lay empowerment kind of question, the way they're able to mobilize connections in the larger community, and yes, the way they're able to use money and their hub partnerships and all sorts of other ways that they found resources for doing the work that they're doing. The second kind of thing that we'll be looking at is questions of process. Some of you may recognize some of these terms from congregational studies, from the book Studying Congregations. We're looking at processes for how they did what they did, the kind of decision-making that went into forming a project or an initiative in the congregation, the ways in which they did or didn't empower groups of people in their congregations. So how did that decision-making work get done in the congregations, and what difference did that make? And finally, yes, we are, even though we're sociologists, interested in theology. We want to know how they are talking about and imagining who God is, how God works in the world, what kinds of old patterns have shaped the way they have responded to the notion of calling, what kinds of new imagining has emerged as they've thought about this call to be more fully engaged as congregations. So those are the kinds of questions, the kinds of factors that we're trying to look for as we allow our researchers out there in the field to just turn them loose, to talk to people, to observe what's going on. And as we glean in and gather in all of that data that Roman was talking about, we'll be looking at all these transcripts, at all of the other kinds of information that our researchers will be sending back to us, and looking for those trends and patterns across congregations to see what is it about the things that happened in the congregation that can help us get clues for how these initiatives, how these interventions, how they worked, what worked, why it worked, and how that can then be mined for insight and wisdom for the future as congregations try to think about how they're going to change.
Great, thanks, Nancy. I just asked in the chat if anybody just had a question about Nancy's comments here before we shift over to another activity. Andy commented that innovation's at the heart of this grant project, and it strikes him that there's an intersection between from and to on Nancy's slide here, that we might see something interesting findings about innovation itself.
Mhm. I think when you talk about innovation, you're essentially tapping what I mean when I say, how do congregations change? Change is innovation. Innovation is change. So the question here is, you gave people an opportunity to change, to innovate. To what extent did they actually do it? And what difference can we see? What things can we find that help us explain where that innovation really took root and where it seems to be struggling along, crowded out by weeds?
Yeah, by like a pandemic, maybe even.
Yeah.
And of course, we know across the 13 hubs that some hubs really focused on like practices of innovation or teaching innovation, like ABC and Fuller, and several of you really dove into the innovation language or resources, and others did not so much. So there's an interesting thing for us to think about too, as we think about how and what kind of impact the hubs had on congregations. Any other questions before we shift to Roman? Any comments?
Well, I think that, you know, I hadn't honestly thought about thinking about innovation and the way that Andy's proposing here is to really think about it as a way for us to be sort of combing through the data in the future, looking at that specific term and how it's playing out as a concept.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and
thanks for
I
that.
think you might find it differently, but still the initiative, one of the purposes of the initiative was to create these innovation hubs,
Mhm.
you know, that we were to work with congregations to be innovative. And of course, these are experiments. They were kind of given free rein to experiment, and so to speak. So, okay, well, it's about 11:30, and we're going to now put you into what Roman, right? We have about 15 minutes before a lunch break to answer any questions, process what you heard. You can post those in your chat, in the chat. I'll just be watching that. So while you do that, I'm going to ask Jennifer McClure, sociologist from Samford University, who's worked with their hub as well. And as you know, Jennifer conducted a survey for us last spring. If she just has any observations, this is the first she heard of Roman and Nancy's research through the focus groups in phase 1, any other insights she would offer from the survey. Jennifer?
One of the things that I think is a benefit of a survey is it gives us a broader picture. We had more people do the survey than Nancy or Roman can feasibly invite to do the qualitative. But one of the things that I felt like was missing in the survey was stories, because it's hard to get really rich, in-depth stories from a survey. Most of the time we are limiting what options people can give to questions. So I'm really excited. I loved hearing the stories and the quotes today. I'm excited to hear more of them as we go. I think one of the things I'll be curious to see is that in the survey, we did ask different questions about what things are helping you understand your callings. And I was glad to see in that wonderful, engaging map that things around like social justice or community service were showing up, because that was one of the most common things that people said was helping them understand their callings. We also saw a variety of ways in which people thought different elements of their church's ministries reflected calling, meaning, and purpose, whether worship and preaching were high up there. So I was really glad to see that in the map. There were different levels. Some churches were really high on youth and young adult ministry. Some churches were fairly low on it. And so I think it'll be interesting, to see for the things that focus on that, what we find for churches that are making an explicit focus there.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. Okay, some insights from your hub conversations or questions for the research team that you want to raise. What did you think about together? You can just speak aloud if you want now, or put it in the chat. Nancy, are you scratching your hand or are you raising it? Okay, well, too bad. Okay, your hand was up. So I'm sure you have something interesting to comment on.
Wow. I will never scratch my hand.
Yeah, now look,
Again.
everybody's put their hands down.
Never. So we actually had a really interesting conversation about our work with culture change and this meta intervention that we actually did with coaching that we are not sure is going to show up when you look at the smaller interventions that the hubs identified as things that they did. And we found most of the traction and growth and culture change happened in and through this meta intervention of these congregations being coached for 3 years. So that was, I was actually not going to bring that here and was going to, go to Roman and Nancy afterward and say, okay, just want to give you a heads up about this. This is what our conversation focused on. We felt as though adaptive change was something that happened a lot in and through our churches, but we didn't focus on it was because we focused on that and not the technical changes of programs or interventions. But I know that they need to measure something. So that's a whole different rabbit trail perhaps, but that's where our conversation focused.
Oh, that is a really interesting observation. Roman or Nancy, do you have a comment about that?
Yeah, actually, I want to reassure Nancy that in fact that will show up.
Oh, good.
Oh, okay.
We certainly, one of the things we didn't talk about is that when we think about resources that congregations drew on in order to do their work, one of the resources obviously was the hub and the kinds of things that you provided to them, whether it was educational materials or coaching or the peer groups or, all sorts of ways in which not to mention the money too, but the ways in which you have been a part of the process of the intervention. So your coaches in some sense are both a resource question for us and a question of process. That is, what kinds of decision-making and facilitation and so forth were going on in these congregations. I mean, one could imagine a situation where you had a really good coach who was really good with the 3 people the coach most often talked to, but that didn't necessarily, spread out into the larger congregation. I'm guessing that wasn't the case, but that's a question we'll be looking at. So not
great. Well, that's really helpful. That was that was just kind of where we landed.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between an intervention and then this big, larger cultural thing that we were really working on?
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. And several hubs have used coaches, maybe not to the extent that you guys did as one of your key strategies, but that's a great observation, Nancy. Thanks. Thanks for letting me put you on the spot too. Okay, all right. Anybody else want to be put on the spot? Any insights or questions?
I'll ask a question.
Yeah, hi, Catherine. Sure.
So one question would be, is there flexibility in how these interventions are studied? So and will this resonate with congregations, or what happens if they say, well, actually, maybe my intervention looked a little bit different? Is that something that researchers, as full, confession, being a little, having my foot in both worlds, but interested in hearing that, there might be a broader understanding that congregations have of themselves and how we could account for that as researchers, but also, working with hub directors.
Yeah, you may remember that one of the first things we said to you in the training was, we've gotten a little picture of what's going on in these congregations by way of the focus groups and by way of what we heard from the survey. But what was actually going on may not exactly look like what we thought was going on. So your first job as a researcher is to figure out what the most sensible way of describing whatever intervention makes sense to the congregation actually is. And, we think our 10 categories are going to get pretty close to capturing the types of things that people were doing. But, I'm confident that there are some people out there, some of the congregations we're sending you all into, that will think about the primary thing they did in a way that doesn't necessarily fit. And we'll roll with the punches.
Yeah, you could think of it as a little bit of one of those Where's Waldo books, right? You have that first page where it shows you what to go looking for. And then as soon as you start working your way through that book, you see, oh my goodness, there's so much more going on here. Those categories that we provided that sort of drew out of the early part, the focus groups, are broad, right? They're not super specific. They're not meant to be limiting. They're starting points.
And they really do also connect with the kinds of questions that were asked on the survey. So people were asked on the survey, what did your congregation do? And what of what your congregation did made a difference to you? And so something like preaching and worship, for instance, is something that showed up a lot in the survey. And it also showed up in the focus groups.
Thank you all. That's so helpful. And it also resonates with some of the questions folks are reading here about questions of practice or how that naming happens. So I appreciate that, that awareness and openness. And I think it's an exciting way to do the research.
I'm confident that most of the congregations won't necessarily think about what they did as an intervention. That's our language for thinking analytically about what's going on here. But we need to be tuned in to their language of talking about what they did and how they describe it.
I was going to agree with that, Nancy. That word intervention is something in current culture that means something entirely different to people. So when you say intervention, most people go to the television scene where there's an addict in a room or somebody's in a room and the family is around and loving them and trying to make them change. And, so I think that we have to be very circumspect when we might know that word, but I don't know that even in our congregations, I would say we're going to do an intervention, because I think it would be too much for them to try to switch in their minds what's been cemented in their minds from modern day culture. So I think what was helpful for me even is when you guys said intervention is being innovative in order to empower. So if we can, if in our case, if we can find some language around that, it probably will be much more effective than intervention.
Yeah,
Phyllis just said ministry. It's really just ministry.
Yeah,
it's an activity of the church, right?
Yeah.
Rest assured that the folks that we're asking to go out and do the research in the field aren't going out and saying, okay, tell us about your intervention.
I'm glad,
they'll be
because that'll
talking
shut them
about
down.
they'll be talking about specific activities that sound a little bit more like the titles of the intervention. Tell us a little bit more about what you've been doing to engage your neighborhood.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about congregational discernment. Oh, is that even the right way to talk about what you did? How do you see it?
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
let us, and so just a reminder here, this is ethnography. And what ethnography is designed to do is to help us see the world through the participants' eyes. Right. And so we're going out and we're saying, okay, we're showing up with our own glasses, but really at the end of it, we want to see through their lenses. And so I think that language might take on a little bit of a different characteristic, a little different flair. Some of the words might change, definitely be better in terms of descriptive. And I hope that our sort of a little bit more nerdy language of intervention isn't off-putting or derailing the process. I mean, you can think about it. You could use the word strategy if you prefer. Really, we're looking at strategies for change, right? And that's all we mean to say. It's just shorthand. Maybe this is partly a lesson for us. Maybe we just need to talk about it differently.
We'll just take it as sociology language, okay?
Yeah.
Not to be used outside
forgive
the
us,
house.
you know. This is what we
Okay,
talk about. Yeah.
I would still interject into that in terms of what we're doing. I mean, I don't necessarily think of myself as distinct from our congregations, and even referring to them as a they. We're facilitating a process that our congregations are participating with. So I will say the word intervention was off-putting for me because so understanding it's a sociological term is one thing, but we consider ourselves a part of and part with our congregations. It's just in this space in general. I don't know if we're talking about ethnography. I think many of us may consider that we are the same people as our congregations. They just happen to be the folks participating in this process. So I will just go ahead and say, I don't know that it's the best language used for this space, even though we're all now clear on what it means. We're not here to do sociology. We are here to do theology and congregational vocation. And we can be clear on what needs to be used. But I think that was part of the conversation. This isn't about them. There's not a them. This is us. And the congregations are the particular folks who are being walked with in this process.
Thanks, Joy. Thanks. That's a good clarification for our terms and for us as a community as well, and our language. Okay, I do see we just have a minute. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, just again, a very good reminder that the particular way in which people in the hubs interacted with people in the congregations is one of the questions here. And Joy's description of that particular kind of relationship that they've tried to cultivate, that's something important for us to listen to and listen for and think about how that served as a particular kind of resource and support and nurturing for all of the people involved in that particular group of congregations.
Great, thanks. Roman, do you want to just say a word about the timeline here? We just have about a minute left.
Sure. The project really falls into 4 parts. The first part was the focus groups. The second part is the field research that we described today. And then there are 2 parts that fall after that. One is analysis, and the 4th part is reporting back. Right now, we're just barely into that second phase of research. We expect that it's already begun. We've met once, and with our research associates, most of them are hired. They're hitting the field. They were asked to do at least an observation or an interview over the last few weeks. We're meeting again on Saturday. That process of doing the field work will last probably into next summer. The next stage, it's nice because the next stage can begin even as that current phase is underway. So that involves analysis. So as the interviews come in, as the field notes come in, they can be used to do our analysis. as that second phase is progressing. So all that to say, by next fall, we anticipate having all the research completed and the analysis pretty well wrapped up, so that at our meeting next year at this time, we'll have more to say about the ways in which you have encouraged one another, your congregations, your participants, however it is that you think of them, to grow and to change. And for me, I just say this, for me, the compelling part about doing this kind of work is that I don't see it as much as that I'm doing research, as I'm helping a group of people who are out to change the world to do their job and to do it really well, and to bring back, to echo back observations that empower you and empower those congregations to live those lives of meaning, purpose, calling that this project's about. And so that's what's exciting to me, and that's what we hope to do and to support you in that way.
Great, thanks, Roman. Well, I think I can speak for everyone. Roman and Nancy, this was tremendous. Thank you so much. I think we learned a lot from just your initial gleanings of just this dip into these focus groups. And we're of course thankful for all the hub directors that worked with you, got congregations involved and their leaders and participants. And I hope it really bore fruit for them too, to participate in those focus groups. So we're going to take a break now and for lunch.